Great. Thank you so much, Azia and Ibrat. I really appreciate the invitation, and I really appreciate you all for being here. As Azia mentioned, it'd be great to have a conversation. There's a lot of human capital in this Zoom session, and I'm really happy to, I guess, hopefully be a catalyst for that conversation for a conversation. Um, so a little bit about myself, just to so I can share my own perspective. I have a foundation in personnel economics, but I came from a multidisciplinary PhD program, and I come from a multidisciplinary department here at Carlson School of Management in Minnesota. I publish widely, Quarterly Journal Economics, RISTA, Jolie, but also like AMJ, SMJ, Org Science, Management Science, LR Review. I also co-author widely, sometimes with economists, sometimes with like org theorists or strategy scholars in psychology, and also do receive editorial work, oftentimes on topics like gender inequality. I'm using administrative data at org science, and also as an associate editor at management science. And so I'll say there's such a big topic and there's so many wonderful papers, both classically and also that are just coming out right now. For this forum, I really wanted to focus on really like the newest papers that I see that are oftentimes done by by emerging scholars. And I guess, but I'll also focus on papers that are coming out more in the economics literature, just as kind of a way of organizing things. This isn't just, and again, this is just a slice of the pie, and there's fantastic work, of course, being done in other fields, some of which I'm less familiar with, but I guess I'll do a shout out given my senior org science hat. We just accepted a paper, I handled a paper that's coming out on temporal variability on one's career progression, which is a really neat paper about using LinkedIn data showing that when a firm acquires another company in another time zone, then that can place extra demands on women's intertemporal demands and demands on their time. And it shows that using LinkedIn data and essentially constructing data from promotions from LinkedIn, show that after these cross time zone acquisitions happen, women's promotion rates decline. So really cool paper. Again, I'm going to be kind of setting aside all of this really neat work outside of the economic journals for this talk, but share it with the group. This is kind of just the underpinning of the presentation itself, but we'll go from there. Yeah, feel free to raise your hand. You could put it in chat if you like, but yeah, or I guess probably raise your hands and we're going to conversation. So this is a way of organizing my talk. I wanted to talk about, I guess, just to classify. I'll start by classifying the literature really into maybe into two categories, which are papers that primarily focus on demand side mechanisms. And so these would be papers focusing on what's going on kind of behind the boss's desk one way or another. And then I'll go on to the supply side, which are what's going on for workers. And so I'll start with the demand side papers. So the demand side papers really draw upon, I think, classical theories. And so kind of the presumptive theories would be like managers' taste-based discrimination, where like managers might have some bias against hiring a certain gender, or sometimes it's applied to different races. Then there's versions around statistical discrimination, where managers have some beliefs about the productivity or other attributes of some minority group. Like in the case of gender, typically that would be like likelihood of taking like a leave of absence, or and then there's also stereotypes or behavioral biases. At least in the economics literature, probably the presumptive theory of stereotypes now is this paper by Bordallo, which is a kind of a neat paper, but you can see how it can come up in gender inequality research as well. So, the economic model of stereotypes is based on this idea that there could be some kernel of truth, like for example, Norwegians are taller than Americans, which is true, but it turns out that when people try to make try to make assessments about how, like, how big the difference is, people tend to overestimate the true differences based on those true gaps. And so, and so you can see how like stereotypes could, come up in organizations as well. And then the other type of demand side theories would be like the technological requirements of the job. So for instance, in that org science paper, they, if a company is making an acquisition across time zones, then they could just be required to be available at all hours of the day, for instance. Or if you're hiring to be like a firefighter or something, then there's just simply the requirements that you have explosive strength or something. There's also great demand side evidence. I think, like, some papers are pretty good at isolating demand side, that something's going on the demand side. I think some of the classic stories I might be familiar with would be like Bertrand and Mulleinathan with the correspondence study, where they sent out resumes and then they changed in that case, the race of the person applying. And now there's some other recent paper too, where they do the kind of a large scale correspondence study for Fortune 500 companies. There's direct evidence of bias. I think like Golden and Rouse is another good example of demand side bias, where they like blind the gender of someone who's auditioning for a major orchestra, and after that you see a growth of women who are being hired into the great orchestras based on gender blind auditions. And so these are all the things that are, so I think there's kind of an underlying like classical theories for thinking about what's going on the demand side, and there's also strong evidence that something is going on the demand side. So now we'll make this transition to some working papers. Again, I wanted to talk about really, I think like really the papers that are really on the cutting edge, or just at the start of so this is so I'll talk about my paper, which is currently under revision at the AAR, and then I'll also talk about Tatiana Mocanu and Heather Saracen's papers. These are the job market papers when they were junior academics, but have since become fairly well known in the space. So and so this is so I'll start with my paper and maybe why this is so on top of my mind. And by the way, a lot of this part is I give credit to AI to do, but this is apparently what AI thinks about our paper. But in this paper called Potential and the Gender Promotion Gap, what we do is we build upon a paper that we had just done. This is with Daniele and Kelly Shue, which is we did a paper on the Peter Principle. It's this idea that firms prioritize job performance in the prior role, making promotion decisions. And now the problem is when you're looking at like a low-level individual contributor, promotion could involve leading people or managing people, and that could be challenging or that could maybe be flawed if maybe the skills that make you good in your prior job don't necessarily make you a good manager. Maybe the best doctor doesn't make the best hospital administrator, or the best academic doesn't make the best dean per se. But nonetheless, we find evidence, at least from sales, that that firms promote the best salespeople, even in cases where it appears they're going to make bad managers. And we could think we could show that they ignore the information of whether they're a good manager. So when we wrote this paper, now the story that we consistently got from organizations is that we have ways of addressing this. And one of our main ways of addressing this is this thing called 9-box. I'm curious, I would be curious to know, I'm always curious to know how often academics have heard of 9-box. It seems like, if you kind of worked in a professional organization or a consultancy, or HR, my experience has been like my students all have heard of 9-box, but at least among economists, essentially 0 people have heard of 9-box. But 9-box is typically referred to as a succession planning tool, where managers will rate their subordinates into one of these 9 boxes. And so you could be high, medium, low performance, and you could be high, medium, low potential. And to me, this is like someone who's like fundamentally interested in HR more than anything. This seems like prima facie evidence that the Peter Principle could exist, because if you find somebody who is like a stellar salesperson or a stellar researcher or something, you put them in the high performer box with low potential, and then you can kind of keep them in that, and kind of keep them, doing what they're good at without necessarily having them lead people. Alternatively, you can put somebody in the high potential box, even if they're a low performer. Now, there's if you dig into this, I've never dug into saying, oh, then there's 9box, and I was presenting this. About half the people in the audience, for like HR managers, would audibly groan. Like, a lot of people hate 9box. And the reason why they hate 9box is this idea that it's very subjective. And in particular, it's this idea that 9box could be very biased against women, and particularly in the potential dimension. And I think there's great evidence, particularly from org theorists, and I think like a role congruity theory, like Alice Eagley is probably maybe the best example of this. But I show that when somebody is asked to rate the potential or the leadership abilities or of women in particular, they sharply underestimate those for women, that women are stereotypically less likely to have the same traits that people also stereotypically associate with leaders. And so we try to test this. We try to test for gender bias and the potential dimension and how that can lead to bias and promotion rates. And so what we do is we have a large retail firm, which is a nice setting. They have in this case over 1 million workers and about 30,000 core salary managers. And these core salary managers, most of them are already managing other people. But promotion would involve typically leading larger teams. And for this provider, we have organizational positions, gender, and 9box ratings, and for some of them, we also have objective measures because it's retail. There are some objective measures for some of them. And so today you'll see a few of these figures, but it's maybe no surprise. You climb the organizational hierarchy, find fewer women. That's the case in our organization. It's also maybe because it's a larger organization with very formal practices, this is actually more gender equitable than the U.S. labor market as a whole. If I plotted this using public data, there's actually more women at the top here than elsewhere. And so they're trying to use essentially like the best practices among 9box, like using calibration meetings, like higher level calibration meetings, to try to address bias. Something that smaller organizations might not do. But even so, this is what the boxes look like, the frequency distributions. And so you have these 30,000 some managers and professionals who are being rated by their bosses. So women are more likely to be in this high performer with low potential box. And they're less likely to be in the high potential box. And this is, I think, all the more surprising given that the people who are in high potential boxes, they tend to get promoted into the next job. And so they kind of get, and so their potential tends to reset. Now, if you look at the promotion rates in these boxes, being labeled as like a high performer with low potential, that's not really much of a consolation prize because these are the promotion rates in these different boxes. And so the high performers with low potential tend to have very low promotion rates. I think when we're working with organizations, one of the things I found too is in this organization, like they had done an analysis saying, oh, there is no gender disparities in our promotion rates because we can explain why women have lower promotion rates. It's because through 9box, it's because controlling for these based on what box you're in, there's no gender gap, and in actuality, that's true. Women on average in these different boxes actually do better, have higher promotion rates than men, but women's potential ratings are so much lower that it really overwhelms that effect, and so women have lower promotion rates. And I think this is striking because I'm always a bit skeptical when I hear that organizations did some analysis of gender and bias in promotion rates, because because, if it's the case that they are rating women as being lower potential, and they're saying they're controlling for potential when they're trying to analyze whether there's a gender gap, well, if the potential ratings are biased, then in that case, they're still being biased in who they promote. Um, and so, uh, and so to look at the gender gap in the 9-box ratings now, if you look at the left panel here, this is the share of the 9-box performance dimensions and potential dimensions for men. So you see this concentration of like median performance with slightly lower potential. And then the right panel is the relative shares of women. And so women are more likely to get the highest performance category and less likely to get the highest potential categories. And we estimate in this paper that the gap in the potential ratings is explains about half of the promotion gap between men and women. And so a lot of the share really comes on this like practice that appears to be objective. You have this, this quantified measure. It's have this like process of like calibration meetings and so on. But like in our case, like what we do is we well, I'll show you what we do. And so another thing is we just we show that basically this gap is persistent throughout the whole life, but maybe more concentrated kind of in the early 40s, which is kind of consistent with other estimates. And oh shoot, I forgot to put my main figure. So the other thing we do is we look at whether the potential rating is whether women outperform their future, women outperform their the past ratings of their potential, and so it could be the case that women are getting lower potential ratings and despite high performance ratings if, for instance, their performance declines in the future, either in their current job or when they get promoted. But we find that's not the case. Instead, we find that women actually outperform the past ratings of their potential. And so we try to check to see some of the ways that organizations could try to address this. For instance, like our organization had a program where they had tried to match female managers with female bosses. But we find that at least in our case, really the big homophily effect, or the big benefit that's out there, is if you're a man, you want to be assigned to another man. Men think other men are really high potential, but if you're a woman, whether you're being assigned to a female or a male, doesn't really help you. Maybe like another way to put this is that like that women tend to rate both genders lower on potential. We also find that for age, that older managers tend to rate both men and women as a higher potential, but there's not really much of a gender difference. And then for higher performers, you could say, well, we should assign women to higher performers, but in that case, we don't find any evidence that. We actually find evidence that that high performers are more biased in their evaluations of their subordinates than others. So I think and this is going to be like a theme I'm going to talk about in other papers today. But in our case, we find that when somebody is high risk of loss, managers are more likely to rate them as higher potential. So part of these evaluations, they rate whether someone they think is more likely to leave. And we find that because in our case, men are more likely to quit for better job opportunities. They do get higher risk of loss ratings. Managers seem to realize this. That also seems to translate into higher potential ratings. And this really came from interviews that we did at the company, but also there's some other papers done by Frank Grabner and Isabella Mowers that show that people kind of think strategically, and also Judith Konecki, that show that people really think kind of strategically about when they disclose the potential ratings. So like in 9box, for instance, usually companies don't disclose potential ratings to subordinates. It's supposed to be like a firm resource, not like something that would be disclosed to workers. Um, but managers, they say, well, don't quit. I'll rate you as high potential. You stick around for a little longer, and we can get you promoted. And so that seems to benefit women as well, or benefit men as well. I think another obstacle from the point of view of a manager trying to build the best team as possible is that when a high performing man is passed over for promotion, they're more likely to quit within the next 3 months. But the same isn't true for high performing women who are passed over for promotion. And so these are the turnover rates for these passed over men, other men who are, and then passed over women, and then other women. And especially for these high performers, there's this sharp increase in turnover right after you promote somebody other than the high performing man. And strict only for those high performing men. So I think like for some like takeaways, I think in this paper we find that these ratings of potential in particular, and maybe 9box generally, could be a bias against women and drive a promotion gap. And maybe it's not such a great idea to just ask managers to rate their subordinates on potential and expect a non-biased result. And I think this is really something that I think has become I guess maybe to editorialize, it's typically these programs are run by psychologists at companies, even though much of the psychological research is kind of skeptical about using these practices. And so as opposed to more objective, like IO psych batteries that are better validated and more scrutinized. And so I think this could be, I think like a way, I think like, part of this could be, psychologists should be in the gym. You should be using more of these validated tests rather than relying on managers who might be biased, who might be indulging in their biases. And then also there's, I think there's not a lot of scope for fixing attrition through manager assignments, and that managers could be gaming potential ratings to avoid attrition and reflect on women's perceived preferences. So I think like for future work, I think, I think it'd be great if like companies could replace subjective measures of potential with more objective measures. And I also think that we should better know like managers, how they strategically use 9box ratings to retain high performing, the other thing to use it to try to retain high performing and both the focal worker and those on the team. So maybe we should have like a conversation at the end. So yeah, I think Fernando, if you have a question, that'd be great. But yeah, maybe we'll maybe lump all the demand side papers together and then come back to it, because I realize I spent maybe too long on my own. I'll talk about some of these other wonderful papers too. So then I want to say about this other paper, Tatiana Mocanu, who she was a job market candidate a few years ago, went to Columbia's business school, but she has a really neat paper on Brazil federal and state workers, and in particular, and I think this paper will do very well. But the setting is in Brazil. She's using data from the public sector from 1980 to 2020. And there's this really neat kind of a natural experiment where in 1988, Brazil implemented a constitutional reform that required government employers to use impersonal and impartial hiring practices. And the federal government adopted the policy immediately first, and then states kind of followed at different times because there was no formal requirement for how long or for when the implementation had to occur. So the main nature of the changes ultimately were that typically the federal government or the state could be adopting things like interviews that were subjectively scored by the hiring team, and then the big switch was that there's a lot of units switched exclusively to written evaluations that were blinding, where the evaluators were blinded as to the person being evaluated. And then in some cases, having a mix of formal written tests that were blind, but then also having a subjective component as well. And And of course, the data are messy. There's a bunch of people. And so what Tatiana does is she adopts a natural language processing algorithm, NLP algorithm, to transform 35 million text documents from essentially the equivalent of FOIA across these federal and state agencies into data on job applicant performance and the evaluated decision-making process, including the job openings and offers, applicant and managers at entities, the candidate scores, and even like the written comments provided by the hiring committee. And the big question is that did the reforms affect the probability that women were hired into these federal and state roles? And so, here's how kind of the process works. So we have the hiring process and stage where the job is posted, the candidates apply, and then typically there is a switch from having these like non-blind subjective process to having like these blinded written exams, or but that's at least like one component of it. So here's like the different types of jobs that that was affecting. We have like, the lowest level cooks going up to like nurses and spokespeople and judges. And so doctors, these are all throughout through the Brazilian government. And here's the killer figure. I mean, I try to encourage everybody to try to have, killer figure in the paper. But I think this is kind of very nice. So this is, these are the probabilities, these are the final scores, and the ratings of the applicants after the 1988 reform. And you can see that for the federal government and for those states that adopted the plan, there was an increase in the scores for women. And that just in the treated group and not in the control group that didn't make the changes. Here's another, I think, great figure. So you have these some units that went from a non-blind written exam to a blinded written exam. There appears to be some improvement for the hiring gap. More women were getting hired. There's also the non-blinded written exams to the blinded written exams that seem to have perhaps like the largest gaps, going from a non-blind to a blinded written exam. There's also those that had like a blinded written exam, but also had some like non-written component as well. Those interviews, which also they also seem to do better. So whereas these ones where there's some where they adopted some non-blinded component, there was less of a gap. So anyway, so like a really nice, basically show this with ugly tables, but yeah, basically it's just kind of a really neat design, I think, and kind of a really interesting use of NLP to kind of construct like a big data set and use, in this case, this intervention. So, if you're interested in the paper or the findings, you can see when there's some other analyses of like when women are on the hiring committee, it looks like this is perhaps an effect where women are on the hiring committee. It looks like men's ratings of female applicants go up, which is, I thought it was kind of an interesting finding. I think if like for our case, like we look at women's ratings of women, but here it suggests that having kind of like maybe like having a peer who having to report to a peer, justify your ratings to a peer could affect the ratings as well. Anyway, so yeah, really neat paper. If you're interested in these topics, check it out. Kind of like a good evidence that like more formal and blinded processes could reduce the gap. Then there's another paper by Heather Sarson. So this paper was done was also a job market paper, and it was about another kind of a neat example of building data from, in this case, administrative records from Medicare data. And so in this paper, she uses Medicare data to look at 120,000 procedures performed by thousands of surgeons, and looked at the outcomes of those procedures, and then see what happens to physicians' future referrals. And in particular, the big finding is that is that she wants to see, well, if there's a negative outcome like a fatality, are men and women published the same, like similarly in terms of referrals, or differently? So and so here's kind of the frequency of like bad events. Basically, for men and women, there's essentially no difference. I guess if anything, like women have slightly lower probabilities of bad events, like a fatality, um, maybe some almost exactly similar probabilities of having an unexpectedly good outcome. You can also show this in the kernel densities. You have estimates of the surgeon's ability based on like the probability of a good outcome versus a negative outcome, like a fatality. Um, and so, yeah, essentially men and women, there's no difference, but in terms of patient outcomes. But if you look at what happens, right before a fatality, men and women have similar referral patterns. But then right after a fatality, women and women alone get fewer referrals. Uh, and so it looks like there's an asymmetric negative effect just for women. So this is kind of like I think the great figure for this paper. Um, it also seems to affect other surgeons as well. So after a female surgeon has a fatality, physicians are less likely to make referrals to other female surgeons as well, which is just I think like a really remarkable finding. I think is very like convincing, compelling with this figure. Um, and so I think interestingly too is that after a fatality, also women are more likely to take less risky patients. And I think like, this is, I think, interesting because, I interpreted this as being primarily a demand side paper. It's talking about like demand for physician services and who gets penalized after a mistake. But it's just really showing that supply is endogenous as well. If you're being asymmetrically penalized for negative outcomes, you might be more risk averse in terms of what procedures you take as well. Um, and so um, and basically there's no kind of asymmetric benefit to women for good outcomes. That's it for my supply side papers, my demand side papers. But yeah, so maybe Fernando, do you want to like kick us off on voice, or does that work? Okay, great.
Hi. First of all, thanks for presenting these papers. They've been awesome. But yeah, with the first paper, when you were talking about the causal direction of risk to leave and potential, you were mentioning that men are seen as more likely to leave and therefore rated as having higher potential. But I just wanted to know if your study included some way to uh, deal with the other direction, that is just that people that are seen as having higher potential are also seen as more likely to leave, or the risk of them living is higher, and that's also why they get rated as being more riskier to leave. So trying to see if you were able to in that study see that direction and be able to see which direction it actually was in.
Yeah, so I guess like literally in terms of the data side, we see uh, this all happens at the same time. Managers report this person is high potential, they are highly likely to leave, and incidentally, like those people who get those ratings are more likely to leave. And so yeah, I think it's the case that people who are rated as higher potential are more likely to leave, and they also get the higher risk of loss ratings. Um, and um, and so yeah, I think it's maybe like a recognition by the manager that if somebody's high potential, they want to keep them at the firm, and maybe in order to do so, or maybe not high potential if they want to keep them at the firm. Uh, someone is um, someone is at high risk of loss. Yeah, they might just rate them as being high potential in order to keep them if they particularly want to keep them. They can use this almost as a high potential rating as a carrot at the end of the stick in order to get them to stay. Um, and so yeah, I don't really know whether I think it's hard to say whether they are truly high potential. I suspect, at least based on conversations that I had with managers, this whole analysis came from a manager who suspected this was going on. But but also it seems like reasonable to think that, look, the potential ratings are so subjective, you might as well use them strategically. And if if they think that men are more likely to leave, give those ratings to they should give the ratings to men regardless of what their true potential is. In terms of whether can we have, I guess, some way of estimating true potential net of the potential ratings. We do this, but not for this purpose. We estimate the potential, what the true potential should be based on the future performance, both within the same role and in different roles. We haven't seen whether, I guess, that would be a way of seeing whether this was of seeing whether the potential ratings were inflated by the manager's perceived thought that they were more likely to leave. Yeah, that'd be a good idea. Yeah.
I have just a quick clarification question on your paper. So the 9-box system. In the paper, you say that the outcomes, either on potential or on performance, are not communicated to the employees, correct?
Yeah.
But
they're not.
Know at least that they are being evaluated on those scales, and can they ask their manager like informally on this information?
I think this is a great question, and so this is not shared. Almost everybody, it seems, knows that these 9-box ratings exist. I mean, for one, a lot of these managers are doing 9-box ratings for their subordinates themselves. Now, can managers ask about their 9-box ratings? Yes, but they're not supposed to. This is meant to be, a firm resource, and it kept on being framed, that way when I was, at least when I was talking to managers of the company. It's not meant to be like something that is developmental. This is like a separate process for the developmental purpose and for the feedback purposes. But then this is supposed to be like the firm's resource. Now, at the same time, like managers say that they could just tell people, and so there's not a lot of evidence on this. And the best I could find is this. I mentioned this paper by Frank Grabner, who did like a survey of like 200 some firms, and they said about like half the firms, as I recall, said that that the 9-box ratings are private, but there's no explicit rule that says that managers can't tell their subordinates about their ratings. And so sometimes you hear about it in different ways, like, oh, you say, well, sometimes this comes up as like, oh, you're putting in a high potential program or something. And so they can find out one way or another, but I think firms try to keep at least like some control over it. Yeah, and Misha asked like about a subjective nature of measuring potential as their way of making it more objective. I think this is like, to me, this is the $1 million question. I don't think I think that there is a difference between performance in your job and potential as a leader. I think that those are two different measures, or two different things that you could think about. But I guess like when you're doing something like 9-box, where you're just simply asking a manager to rate the potential, you're inviting bias. And so so the question is there a way to be more objective about it? So in our other paper with the same co-authors, the QJE, we find out in the sales data there were. So you could have a better measure of potential of a salesperson, have a better measure of potential by looking at the nature of their sales credits, like whether they are involved in more credit sharing and collaborative sales activities versus individual sales. They tended to make better managers. But at the same time, that would be the easiest thing in the world to game. Salespeople can falsely credit each other, and they do that for all sorts of reasons. Like if they're typically these firms use a thing called accelerators, which is very common, like in the business-to-business sales that we do. You want to concentrate as many sales as you can until one quarter, and so sometimes like salespeople, they'll trade credits across different measurement periods just to make more money in commissions. And so now, if you also type promotions to this, then that would just be one more that'd be one more incentive to game that measure. Now, I think like another Another example would be like so Samir Srinivasa, I think, has Berkeley has a paper where they where he tries to use like a email data from a large company, and it's just almost like a passive measure of how like enculturated you are in the organization. I think that would be like it seems very invasive, but at the same time, it is an effort to do this. It is an effort to somehow collect passive information through a means other than through relying on managers' subjective assessments. And maybe to the degree that you could get to do that, that'd be possible. Maybe a third possibility would be to use, I think, the more traditional IO psychology type metrics of where you have like an exam, you test the exam, you're very careful about it, you standardize, you implement it, and then you try to screen people that way. And so I'm not like an expert in those methods, but that it would be, at least in principle, another way of tackling this question of how do we try to get objective measures of this thing we're trying to capture that seems to be important. At the same time, it's the fundamental issue is still, when I talk to IO psychologists, we do have IO psychologists in our department. They say like the mantra is that the best indicator for performance in a future job is performance in a similar role, for past performance in a similar role, better than any like test that you could give them. But then you come back to this problem of if the job is different, like if it now involves managing people, you don't have performance of their future role. And so that's why I think firms are left to speculate and come up with this measures of potential for people doing something that they never observed them to do, but it still seems to be biased, against women. So, yeah. Anyway, I think it's great questions. I think it's like so much to do, and so I think it's been very interesting. Hey, so now I want to talk about some of the supply side stories. I'll talk about 3 papers. Again, I think these are wonderful papers. Ingrid Haegele. I'll start with Ingrid Haegele's here. But this is supply side factors. If you've studied these, these are there's these stories around like classical household models or flexibility preferences. It could be that women have more demands on their household labor, and so they have preferences for jobs that are flexible, or maybe they're more likely to prefer a job that is part-time or something else. There's risk preferences, and so there's some argue that women are more risk averse than men, and so they might take a job that's less risky. And I think the evidence on that is more mixed, but it's at least one hypothesis. And even going back to this previous paper, the Heather paper, well, I mean, if you're asymmetrically penalized for making a mistake, I mean, why wouldn't you be risk averse? And then there's also competitiveness preferences. There's some evidence that women are more likely to apply for a job if they highlighted like a job as being like kind of more cooperative or team-oriented environment versus one where that's more like top-down or more authoritarian or not authoritarian, but as more competitive and more like or something like that. And so this paper is on the broken rung and the leadership gap, again, we're looking at data from a large multinational firm. This is a large German-based one. And using survey data and actual applications, in this paper, Ingrid finds that women are more likely to report that they have a preference for not leading others, and they apply for promotions that don't involve leading subordinates. And the reason why I think, like, if you remember anything from the talk, is this idea that's broken rung. Like, women are equally likely as men to apply for like lateral promotions or jobs from no subordinates to no subordinates. Or even if they do have subordinates, they're more likely to apply for jobs that have subordinates. But it's really this tendency for women who don't have subordinates to rarely apply for jobs that start to involve managing subordinates, which is like the broken rung of this career ladder. So very similar, so Ingrid's version of our declining shares of the gender of the hierarchy. So you get higher up in the organization if you're women. And so why is that the case? Well, so typically the lower levels of the organization, a promotion would involve leading people. That's one of the most salient features of a promotion with the lower levels here. Now, if you ask men and women, these managers, what they would like to do and how they see themselves in their career, really the big difference, more than anything else, is that men and women look very similar, except for this team lead. Women report that they don't see themselves, and they don't want to see themselves leading a team in the future. In terms of what workshops they sign up for the leadership development program, women are far more likely to sign up for jobs or for the workshops that on careers without leadership. And one of the things I found interesting is it's even, there's even not so big of a gap for those on work-life balance, for instance. It's really about career without leadership. There's a vignette study, and so she was able to do a lab in the field type of experiment where she took incumbents at the organization and they asked whether this person will have a difficult experience in their new role as a leader. The experiment manipulated whether the focal person, the fictional person, was a man or a woman. And really the big finding is that women in particular think that the other females in the vignette studies are going to have a difficult experience in their new leadership role. So, and then some of the other supply side papers I'll talk about, kind of will maybe give some hints as to why. So, so in terms of the important features, men and women are asked why they didn't apply for a leadership job, and women report directly. This is over 5,000 women that they didn't apply for the job the next level up because they wanted to avoid leadership responsibilities. As far as perceptions of team leadership, so we'll get current team leaders. So they basically said that they didn't want to avoid conflict that could come from leading a team, and that's true both at the higher levels and the lower levels. So if you look at the transitions again, this really goes back to this broken rung idea that women are more likely to apply for lateral switches. They're more likely to apply for transitions to different divisions, but it's really the promotions that involve going to leading subordinates that have fewer female applicants. She has some heterogeneity around whether full-time versus part-time workers, no children or children, married, not married, female leading area, female supervisors, high female teams. I think these are very reasonable things to look at, but at the same time, it's just varying degrees of differences in promotion of applications for promotions. And so really the main thesis is that it appears that fewer women are applying for jobs that go from no subordinates to managing subordinates. I think this goes back to, again, like I think a big theme, which is, I think this is really neat that this paper was able to build up the set of findings from stated preferences to actual applications to actual promotions. But I guess like one big theme I want to keep coming back to is that in Ingrid's paper, like she finds that once you do have subordinates, you're no less likely to apply for other jobs that have subordinates. So I think like part of it is this idea of like your aspirations are endogenous. Like you're not going to apply for a job involving leading people if, like, for instance, you're not seen as, if you don't feel like you're prepared, or if you feel like the organization hasn't really like treated you or pigeonholed you in that area. Like in the case of my 9-box paper, if they aren't being rated as high potential, they won't get leadership development opportunities. They might not plant that seed in their mind. They might see it as leading more people as less attainable, and so they might not apply. And so I think it's And so I think like there's a supply side story, but there's also, there's also like complicating factors as well. And so it's but anyway, a kind of a very, I think a very neat paper. So there's also this, I think a relatively recent paper, Xie and Kessler. And so this is, I think, a really neat experiment for a few reasons. One is it's maybe one of the, I think it's a very clever experiment. It's an experiment that's done primarily on mechanical Turk, but it's an experiment where that's designed to elicit whether there's a gender gap in self-promotion, or speaking well about your background. And of course, self-promotion, I think, is important everywhere, whether you're applying for a job, in your cover letter, or your interviews. It's important if you're doing like a 360 or a self-evaluation. There's kind of like an art to self-promotion. And so the way that the experiment worked is there's a set of three, I guess like three types of experiments, or three settings for the experiment. But it's MTurk, prolific, and a lab. But in the setup, you have these, in the MTurk example, you have Turkers who take a 20-question math quiz in step 1. In step 2, they're asked to self-report how they think they did on the quiz. And then and then right after that, in some cases, there's employer can sometimes choose whether they see the self-evaluations or see to the degree of their self-promotion. And sometimes they might also be able to see how they actually did on the quiz. And so, or some signal of how well they did on the quiz. So you have a six-wave study. And so you have this case where they can self-promote, they can rate themselves as being highly able in mathematics. And then in the private treatment, the ratings are not disclosed. Their self-assessments are not disclosed to a potential employer. And then there's these different treatment arms. But in the case of the risky self-promotions, it's sometimes shared with employers. And the social norms one, they just said that people who scored similarly to you on the test rated themselves an average of this. They saw if there's like anchoring or some kind of conformity around the social norm, or around that norm. Then you have experimenters where in this arm, they were immediately disclosed the absolute and relative performance in the test. The test subjects were. And then here, the evaluators are asked to evaluate others instead of themselves when they're given the scores. And then here, they're given a non-stereotypically male quiz. Instead of a math quiz, they're given, I think, a reading quiz, or like a verbal skills quiz. Here's the CDFs. And so right means they get rated higher. So women, they are on average in this setting, they actually do perform better than men. So this is shifted right to the men. Now, if you ask them to report their belief on a scale from 1 to 100, women rate their performance, they think that their performance was lower. And again, remember, in some of these treatment arms, their self-assessments are disclosed to the employers. And so they rate themselves as being lower, despite on average being higher performing. And there's a gap between the belief and the performance. And so just to give an intuition of the magnitude, out of 20 questions, men on average think they got 11 questions right, and women think they got an average of less than 9 questions right. And so it's a pretty big gap. And again, like women actually perform better on average. So, and so on the performance question, so in the top left panel here, now we look at the self-rated performance, and then also, and so here again, like this shows that, basically men just report their performance to be higher on average. And they found that the gap only was for math and science, not for reading. So there's not a whole lot of papers that are conducted largely on MTurk or a lab, at least in these journals, but I think it's a kind of a very clever experimental design. And so if you do that kind of work or are interested in that kind of work, then you can encourage you to check out that paper. So then the next paper the last paper I believe I want to talk to you about supply side responses was a paper by Nina Rousille. This is also her job market paper. But the research question is that would providing more labor market information, more benchmark pay information to women lead them to ask for higher pay in their initial offers? And this is motivated, I think, by pay transparency laws in Europe and the United States. There's been a lot of laws now on that are making pay more transparent and pay ranges more transparent. Of course, there's popular book Lean that says that women don't negotiate, or research by Linda Babcock or others that suggest that women are less likely to negotiate. So this is really the main motivation of this paper. So the data come from Hire.com. And so in Hire.com, candidates can post their desired ask salary, and employers can post their bid salary. And if a match is made, then companies can input their final salary. And so you have the ask salary, bid salary, the interview, job offer, and so on. So here's an example of a profile on Hire.com. And so the question is whether a man or a woman would tend to ask for a higher starting pay for similar types of roles. And so here's like a type of a job posting, $135,000 for a software engineer. And so she scrapes these data to create the data set. And so here, actually, let me put this one. So this is an example of the intervention. So as a pilot, Hire.com started to fill out the median salaries based on, or the benchmark salaries based on aspects of their profile and the job. And so they said, well, what are you looking for? Well, we think, by the way, based on your profile, you should be asking for this. And the question, and this replaced this totally empty text box. And so women before the treatment, they were asking for about 5% lower salaries, or about 2 or 3% conditional on all the observables. And that turned into, for these software engineers, almost $4,000, asking about $4,000 less than men. So what happened after the treatment where they are prompted with these benchmark pays? So again, so this is pre-reform. So this is the ask salaries by gender before and after. So and so this is so this is for men. So men, there's essentially no effect. Whether you're below or above, you're asking for about the same salaries as you were before. For women, again, this is shifted left for women because women have lower asks going in, even when they look up, they're similar to men. But after they're prompted with the median, it shifts to the right. They're asking for more now. That's through the whole distribution, but particularly, really concentrated for this middle part, which is similar, reasonable. They're asking for the number that they were prompted. Now, how much does it actually close the gap? Well, here's men versus women. That's how for software engineers. So here's the gap throughout the distribution. And this is after the treatment, or after the pilot, where now Hire.com is giving the target salaries. Well, the gap almost disappears entirely. And so you might think, well, okay, so women are asking for more. Are they being interviewed less now? Well, actually, the opposite is the case. Interestingly, women are asking for more, but those in particular who ask for more than they were before, appear to actually get more interview offers than they were getting before. And so maybe a suggestion that they were perhaps really undervaluing themselves, because they were more likely to get offers, more likely to get placed, and they were asking for more now. And there's almost so this is looking at, okay, well, how much of it is it's you're being, instead of asking for $4,000 less, you're being prompted with a number that's $4,000 higher. How much of this is translating to the ask and the actual offer gap? Well, it turns out there's almost a one-to-one correspondence. It looks like people were putting in a number of $4,000 lower than the benchmark. They're asking for $4,000 more in this post-treatment. So again, I think a really neat study, and I believe this one is just as is forthcoming in the KJ as well. So I think again, really good paper on pay negotiations. Okay, so yeah, one last paper. So this is for the supply side story. So this is Biazzi and Sarson's flexible wages bargaining the gender gap. And so this is asking the question whether pay flexibility leads to a larger pay gap. And so, typically in the private sector, there's some pay ranges for the job. If you're entering a job, you can negotiate where you are in the range. This idea that, the public sector, which will have more formulaic raises, then there should be less scope for bias or discretion, less scope for having a pay gap. And so the strategy is that in 2011, Wisconsin public schools went from looking more like the public sector, where you have these stepwise gaps, and Wisconsin turned over a lot of authority and setting pay back to the school districts as soon as the union, after the union's contracts expire. And so you have this nice experiment where different districts in Wisconsin had their collective bargaining agreements expire at different times after 2011, and you could see how this newfound flexibility affected pay for men and women. And so here we could see, okay, well, this is the declining union membership. Again, the changes in 2011, and here's the key figure. So here's the pay. Here's the pay. These are for bargaining agreements that expired in 2011. Here's for deals that expired in 2012, and then here's the ones that expired later. And so you can see as these collective agreements were expiring, that's when districts had more authority and flexibility to set pay. That's when the gender gap arose in pay. So you can see this dashed blue line is when started to grow after that expiry. Now this if this is a little bit hard to see, we can plot the difference, and so you can see how pre-treatment there's really not much of a pay gap between men and women. After the expiry, this starts to become a growing gap, and it appears to even be growing over time as well. So it kind of, I guess, is more evidence around how formal practices could help ameliorate gender bias. So this isn't, just to say, between Tatiana's paper on the Brazil public sector workers or Wisconsin, these are at least two pieces of evidence for formal practices and more transparency. Maybe if you thought about like my paper on 9-box, it could still backfire. A formal practice, I think, could have the semblance of looking objective, but still be flawed as well. It's really how you implement it. There's also papers that reject this demand versus supply side. I think all these papers do to some degree, but papers maybe more on trying to tackle the intersection there. I think these papers, to me at least, this is most salient of the Shelley Correll's paper, which is a paper of Constraints into Preferences. How this really goes to this idea that it's a really very nicely done experiment. Where women who could basically be primed into thinking that they're bad in a certain area, and then ultimately that'll affect their decisions. And so what looks like preferences in the economic sense of what they choose to do, there's really a product of the constraints that they face. And it goes back to for instance, if women are asymmetrically penalized for bad surgical outcomes, they should go into, it makes sense for them to go into jobs that are less risky, because it's just kind of the rational thing to do. So 2 other papers on this, and this really these are papers that go into backlash. This is the hypothesis that, women might be, for instance, going back to Ingrid's paper now, trying to bring everything together. Women are less likely to apply for leadership positions, but now there's some papers that say that, well, leadership is actually in some ways harder for women, because women are more likely to face backlash from subordinates, in particular backlash from female subordinates, all the time, and maybe particularly when things go wrong. So, and there's a paper by Chuck Bard and Sarah, Gender Leadership in Organizations and the Threat of Backlash. And so the research question is, are women deterred from entering leadership roles due to the threat of backlash? And the authors use it of laboratory experiments. But I won't go too into it, but basically, again, it's a lab study. workers in the experiment have the opportunity to essentially give like a negative signal back to their manager, you see women in particular do not want to have the manager role. That's how the experiment was set up. Now, when they can't send those negative signals back to the manager, then both men and women are similarly likely to report wanting the manager role in the experiment. And so like the threat of backlash could be a reason why women don't want these positions. There's also another really neat paper, super ambitious. It's just, I can't imagine how much effort this was, but it was a paper on that did a series of, they worked with 24 companies in Turkey, fairly large companies. And to these 24 companies, they did interviews, they did climate studies, they had social network data. They had people did lab in the field type experiments with the actual teams. And they're trying to study workplace climate and culture. It's also a very complicated paper with the main components, but here's kind of a nice summary figure. So on the x-axis, we have the share of female leaders that were in the department. On the y-axis, there's the degree of male homophily, which is the department, which has based on social network measures within the different departments of these 24 companies. And on these right panels, we have female homophily. In particular, the paper finds that the prevalence of male homophily they find like the prevalence of male homophily on several outcomes, and that seems to be more important than female homophily or anything else. Basically, if you're a man, you are benefited from having a male as a leader, and also males as the leader's peers. And largely finds that women, having women in more senior ranks isn't good for women so much because women are better to other women. Rather, it's because the male-to-male homophily is so strong, it disrupts that pattern. So it's just really the negative effect that seems to have the biggest consequence on the diversity of social networks at the lower level and so on. Interestingly, though, both men and women report that they want to be managed by men. And so if they ask, like, would you prefer to be managed by a male or a female? Both sexes say they prefer to be managed by a man. And I think like one of the really interesting findings of this paper too is that for women spend a lot more time than men on both the professional and the personal support for their female subordinates. And that appears to be because, especially for like the work-life satisfaction, the work satisfaction, essentially like women are much more penalized than men if they're viewed by their subordinates as being not supportive. And so this kind of goes back to the backlash story, in that women are asymmetrically prone, actually not just averse to backlash, but there appear to be greater backlash specifically against women, and particularly by female subordinates, if they are seen as being not supportive. So, so you can see how this relates to some of the findings we discussed, like women may be rated as low potential, or they might not want to go into leadership roles because they face backlash when they do, and they have to invest more about the personal professional support for their subordinates, because the cost of not doing so could be greater. And that could make their jobs especially demanding. And so maybe this is just our nice, like, quick, summary slide. Here's all the papers we talked about. But this is really showing that another way to talk about this instead of supply and demand is to say, look, we have these maybe new papers on every stage, from applications and the hiring committees and formal pay structures, self-assessments once we're in the organizations, assessment of potential by others, interest in leading, backlash against those who do lead, and then asymmetric penalties for those who maybe take a risk and have a negative outcome. I think like another way to think about maybe the literature is that we have these papers, and they get published. This isn't just for economics, but I think in all journals, you have to try to really pin down a mechanism. I can't tell you how many times been like editor at org science or measurement science, like, oh, what is the mechanism? You have to isolate the mechanism. But it's like, it's almost like it's a really difficult task. You might be able to like look at one mechanism, but still, you have all these papers that are about different stages of the process, from hiring to selection to training, and early career and late career and assessments and promotions. But really, any mechanism that operates in one stage is likely to affect decisions that you make all throughout your career. And so I don't know how you want to put this. Pick your favorite discipline. There's probably some version of this. You could say that aspirations or applications are endogenous. You could say that you could say that there's cumulative advantage or cumulative disadvantage. This is but at the same time, it could be very difficult to write a paper that really acknowledges all these different stages. And I think this is really a challenge for new scholars, because I think really the connections across these different stages and is really, I think, like the ultimate goal of seeing the forest through the trees. If each of these papers are trees. So anyway, so that's it. That's my summary. Happy to open it up for comments, questions, shout outs, papers that you like from that I missed.
This is really great, Alan. All of the papers, super new, super interesting. Thanks for sharing them and explaining them, not only in isolation, but also putting them all together. That's really great. Really appreciate that.
Thank you all. And there's plenty of human capital here, so feel free to share what papers are you thinking about, or findings. What's important to you? I'm seeing folks I know too in the chat too, which is nice.
I'm keeping an eye on the chat to see if there are any questions. I see a lot of gratitude for the talk. And while we are waiting for if anyone is too shy to ask, please write in the chat. And while we're waiting, maybe I could use that time to just ask a couple of small questions. I was wondering, given your background, which is both economics heavy, but also multidisciplinary, and you've also looked at so many papers that are in the economics field or going across, how do you see how the fields that and the authors that work in the different fields, but work on the topic of gender or inequalities in general, how can they collaborate better and maybe enrich each other's findings?
That's a great question, and I think, like, at least like when I was at MIT, I heard this like mantra that the findings shouldn't be depend on the method. That's really bad for science if, like, you can have two different methods and different findings. And so, and I think a lot of the disciplinary divides could vary by method. I think, like, if we're going to maybe take the high road, we're trying to build an understanding of something that I think is very multidisciplinary, that it could really serve by the insights of people doing research from different perspectives. And I think, like, one of the nice things about management science and org science is that they aspire to work across these bounds. I think that, like, from my point of view, for instance, I recently had a paper on gender diversity and hiring committees. It was by an economist, but like in that case, you have, you say, like, look, this is something that, like, people have studied, in different fields. There should be, if someone has done essentially the identical thing in another setting, like, we have to make sure that we're doing justice to the work that's been done in those different areas. And so like, there's a lot of challenges. Different disciplines even have different norms for how they write papers. and of course the literature they talk to. You know, there's all these games around like who do you cite, for instance, if you don't want someone, a certain reviewer. I think like for management science and org science, like for me, phenomenologically, you know, if the thing that you're studying is phenomenologically identical um, to something other people are also trying to learn about and trying to understand, then you know it has to be able to speak to them. Now, there's a question of like how much you go in the first draft versus revision. You know, people say, oh, they might not want to submit to the journal because it's written entirely like a paper in this discipline. I think there's like a middle ground because I don't want to discourage, you know, people from submitting to these journals. And I think like, you know, who you cite, for instance, is something that you could change in your revision. But I think like, you know, you should talk to colleagues, you know, if you're, especially for those journals, you should talk to colleagues, whether it's co-authors or others, like try to, you know, take seriously those ideas to the degree that you are able to in your paper, you know, see if you are able to test those mechanisms that are offered in different, that are typically offered by in different disciplines. And I think, you know, I think like, you know, the best research, you know, I think would be good by the standards of, you know, regardless of, you know, where it's published or so on. So I realize it's difficult, but I think it's, the cause is important. And I, at least as editor, like I would try to help, you know, these papers not be, you know, not be penalized, like, you know, acknowledging that there's some real difficulties of trying to collaborate across disciplines. But, you know, this may be just like something that hopefully we could do in the editorial process to make sure the best papers come through, regardless of who's working together.
All right, thank you. We have a couple of questions in the chat. If you guys would like to unmute and ask it in person, that would be great.
Hi there. I'm Kyle Gerg. I'm an engineer working at a small employee-owned company, and I'm on the DI committee. We formed it about 5-6 years ago. And so I was wondering if you had any recommended papers, references, just looking for effective policies around narrowing the gender gap in mid to senior leadership. We have pretty good gender parity, if you look at overall numbers, and then like especially in the early career folks, but then it seems to drop off mid and then senior especially. So if you had any insight into that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, can I crowdsource this? Maybe if someone wants to suggest a paper, particularly on senior leaders and advance people to senior leadership roles.
If you would like to send an email to me, I think I have a bunch in my database. I'll be happy to share.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. I'll do that. Thank you.
Yeah, so Neha has a comment as well. You able to share?
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the great presentation. I really enjoyed your presentation, and it was very insightful. In this regard, so I'm from the OBHR background. So I was reading on the biases from that perspective. And when we look at the biases, there have been a lot of papers which talk about self-promotion bias. So the paper that you spoke about, where you say that women are not doing the self-promotion, and that is also leading to the pay gap. But then the other side of the papers that I have read about is that if a woman self-promotes, then she's less likely to receive a hiring call or even a promotion. And in fact, even a different type of rather than a boilerplate, if there is at the time of hiring a female CEO, the company puts out the praises or the abilities of the female CEO, then also she faces a backlash because the expectations are raised. So what are your thoughts on how do we look at this entire bunch of research from economics as well as from human capital together, and what would be the future directions? Of course, it's a more detailed discussion, but maybe some insights.
I think that's a great point. And for the most part, I think, and this goes back also to like the Heather Sarson paper on the surgeons. If you're responding to incentives also. I don't know if this is a bad way of like reframing like an OBHR argument, but yeah, I think it's like you have a if women aren't self-promoting, there could be like, well, but interpreted in the context of that paper, let's say they do self-promote, and then women are asymmetrically penalized for overselling themselves, or otherwise stereotypically or somehow like seen as being perceived as being like, to use a gendered word, like, bossy or assertive, like too assertive or something, or somehow asymmetrically as opposed to like a leader or something, then in that case, you could call it gender bias and self-promotion and say, but at the same time, it's the rational response to what's going on the other side of the table. And I think this is just why I really love reading like OBHR papers, is because like in the case of Ninebox, for instance, our paper, like this is something that really came from that literature. And so yeah, I think it would be a great direction. And this Exley paper, that this is only 2 years old in economics, but probably has some catching up to do. So yeah, if you have any suggestions for future reading, yeah, go ahead. Or if you could, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so yeah, Yamana.
Hi, I am Mana. I also had a question, but it's a bit more about the design. I was wondering, since you go through so many studies and they're very recent, maybe you also have suggestions for the design of a study. So like if someone wants to do something, you cannot do experiment on gender, but maybe someone wants to have a more isolated environment for a like certain stage or certain perception. For example, like if people just develop different perceptions of leadership just based on the gender, so like that the environment can be more under control. So is there like paradigms, already established paradigms that can be used to conduct such studies? Do you know of tasks or games?
So I guess like again, like feel free to, anyone should feel free to chime in. I guess like two examples. So one in like a lab type of study. This is similar to like the Exley paper, but also there's some other papers, and I believe it's a Danish author. I don't want to butcher the name, but it's but the idea is like you have like some first stage of an experiment where you try to capture some objective measure, for instance, of leadership abilities, and then in the second period, you disclose how much the hirer, the counterparty, gets to observe that measure when they're making the decisions. And in some cases, that's used to, for instance, test for like race-based bias. Well, like do you overcome your race-based bias if you can see that someone of this minority did very, very well on the first stage of their experiment. And in some cases, like people are still biased. For them, maybe it's not about the race, it's about not wanting to hire someone in a different group. I think there's also another version, like in Abraham Melanothan and a lot of studies, sometimes they manipulate how much information is given, like in a resume, for instance. So if they have like a really brief resume, then there might not be much information. So like there's this like an example again from race would be Agan and Starr is a paper on like on whether looked at what happens when states, well, so this is a field study, but it was what happened when states prohibited workers from asking about a criminal record. And so in that case, after states prohibited that, there's less information to go on for employers, and so they were more likely to infer like that African Americans had a criminal record, and it's actually that policy was very, very bad, particularly for African Americans who did not have a criminal record and happened to be a boon to white Americans who did. So and so like there's ways of either using correspondence study or using policies like that to look at the effect of disclosing more information. And I imagine like it could be imported to like leadership type qualities as well. I'm not familiar with any like experiment for like particularly on leadership, but maybe someone is.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, I checked the paper on gender gap in self-promotion, and they also tried to do it like with an individual task, like a mass task, and then like something else. Yeah, so thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.